So Corrine and Ben, does it look like we've got everybody in here who is planning to join us?
Yeah, and people will still keep coming in. We are at 62 people right now.
That's great. So this is great. It's Friday afternoon. People are sharing their time with us. It's exciting. So I'll go ahead and kind of kick us off and welcome folks. And then we have some great speakers, and it's going to be an interesting hour, I think. So welcome to our Constitution Day event. I'm Andrew Fiala. I'm the director of the Ethics Center here at Fresno State. We do events like this all the way through the school year, about a dozen events, panel discussions, lectures, interviews. And the goal of this kind of event is to, raise awareness, celebrate critical thinking and civility and civil discourse. So, the goal is to just get people to think carefully about the world and about ethical issues in the world. I'm really happy that we can do this Constitution Day event and collaborate with the Political Science Department. Very thankful to Professor Holyoke and his colleagues in political science, who we've collaborated now for a couple of years on these kind of events, and it's a great thing. So thank you, Dr. Holyoke. And I'd also like to thank, behind the scenes here, we've got Corrine Wang, who is in the Alumni Association, and my student assistant this semester, Benjamin Cruz, who are helping to run the webinar and all of that stuff. So thank you to all those folks. So this is Constitution Day, September 17th. We are celebrating something that happened in 1787, which was when the founders signed the Constitution. If my math is right, that's about 234 years ago. I checked it on my calculator, so I think I got it right. But anyway, this day is routinely an opportunity around the country for people to think about issues in relation to the U.S. Constitution. So that's our goal for today. And as you know, I think our panelists are Professor Tom Holyoke and two students, Ann Kreuscher and Elise Higgs. So what I'm going to do very quickly is read a brief introduction for each of them. We'll turn it over to Dr. Holyoke, who will give us remarks 15 or 20 minutes or so. We'll see how long it goes. And then each student, respondent, will offer about 5 minutes of response. And then we should have plenty of time for Q&A at the end. So let me tell you a little bit about that Q&A function, just in case you're wondering when it will be your chance. You'll see on the Zoom format, there is the thing called Q&A. We want to encourage you to use that. I'll help moderate that feature, but please remember, again, this is supposed to be civil discourse, respectful dialogue, reasonable questions. These issues, especially the pandemic and the Constitution, there will be disagreement. That's okay. Just be polite and be reasonable in our disagreements, okay? And remember, we're all trying our best to make sense of this stuff. So that being said, let me now introduce our panelists. So Dr. Tom Holyoke is professor of political science at Fresno State. He has a PhD from George Washington University in Washington, D.C., a master's degree from Syracuse University, and a bachelor's degree from Drake University. He's the author of 3 books, including Interest Groups and Lobbying, subtitled Pursuing Political Interests in America, another book called The Ethical Lobbyist, which we should have him back just to talk about that for the Ethics Center. His research and teaching focus on American politics and government, interest groups and lobbying, Congress, and he also works on Western water policy and politics. He served as chair of Fresno State's Academic Senate, and he was recently honored with the Provost's Award, the Fresno State Provost's Award for University Service. It'll be his turn in just a second. But before we let Dr. Holyoke speak, let me introduce Ann Kreuscher. She has a German heritage. We talked about that a little bit, Ann. Ann is a senior majoring in political science. She's a Schmidt-Camp Family Honors student and is currently president of Fresno State's Honors Political Science Society. She's currently doing an internship with the Panetta Institute in Washington, D.C. She's joining us actually from Washington. She hopes to attend law school after graduation. And then finally, we have Elise Higgs, who is a double major in political science and philosophy. She's a member of the Smith-Camp Family Honors College and is involved in Fresno State's mock trial and moot court teams. She plans on attending law school after graduation with the goal of becoming an international human rights attorney. So it's really exciting to have students join us. And now let me give the floor over to Professor Holyoke. Tom, the time is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Fiala. And thank you to the Fresno State Ethics Center and the Fresno State Alumni Association for organizing Constitution Day for us. I think it is very important that at least one day out of the year, that we set aside one day out of the year to appreciate the incredible Constitution that we have here in the United States. It establishes the rule of law in our country, though it does always fall to us as an informed citizenry to make it all actually work. And my thanks also to Anne and Elise for being willing to participate in Constitution Day with us today. When students, both political science and philosophy majors, take the Constitution seriously, well, we know as professors that we've done something right. Today, I think we arguably face the severest public health crisis of our lives. Fortunately, our nation has been through this before, and we know how to deal with it, if only we have the will to do so. While some have also portrayed the COVID crisis as having led to a constitutional crisis, where they say the cure is literally worse than the disease, to paraphrase James Madison, this is really just not true. While the governments, both federal and state, have had to invoke extraordinary powers to deal with this health crisis, there is plenty of precedent on how to handle it legally, and in my opinion, and I confess I'm a political science professor and I'm not a constitutional lawyer, but in my opinion, no legal or constitutional boundaries are being crossed. Where are we today on September 17th, 2021? By now, COVID has been an overriding factor in our lives for 17 or 18 months. No doubt we will lose at least 2 years of our lives to it. Many have lost their lives entirely to it. Over 41 million cases of COVID have been reported in the United States, and there have been nearly 661,000 deaths since February of 2020. Around the world, deaths are in the millions, though an exact count may never really be known. But we have light at the end of the tunnel. In fact, we should have been standing at the end of the tunnel some months ago. Only there are people who have refused to embrace the solution, the obvious solution to our crisis. In an extraordinary demonstration of the scientific prowess of modern medicine and public health research, 3 powerful and effective vaccines now exist and are easily available to the public. So much so that since late March or April, nearly every American adult could get a vaccine if he or she wanted one. So far, approximately 209 million Americans have received at least 1 dose of vaccine. Unfortunately, that is only about 63% of the population. And the US Centers for Disease Control, the CDC, says we need at least 88% for the kind of herd immunity that will really beat COVID into the ground. More unfortunately, the rate of vaccination in the United States started to flatten in the summer as everyone who really wanted a vaccine got one. And it was those who were resistant who held back and caused the vaccination rate to begin to flatten. Most unfortunately, soon after this decline in vaccination rates began, a highly infectious variant of COVID, which we call Delta, emerged and has ravaged the unvaccinated, and unfortunately ravaged even a small portion of vaccinated people. We know how to stop this. We need to reach herd immunity with the vaccination rate. But if the low-hanging fruit of people has been plucked, what are we to do? How do we respond to the ongoing public health crisis, a crisis that is really now entirely of our own making? Well, after long months of debate, too long in many people's opinions, including mine, public sector governments and institutions, including state universities, are finally implementing, or at least talking about implementing, vaccine requirements for their employees. Many private sector businesses are starting to think about it as well. For the unvaccinated, who won't respond apparently to carrots, they are now being threatened with the stick of losing their employment. Showing some kind of long delayed leadership, President Joe Biden has indicated that he is requiring all federal workers, most federal contractors, and even the US military to become vaccinated. He is also ordering the US Occupational Safety and Health Administration, that's OSHA, to require medium and large businesses to have their employees vaccinated. Pardon me, the overhead lights seem to have just gone out in my office. There we go. That's what happens when you have time-sensitive lighting in your office. President Biden's move is arguably brought on by desperation, really. And it's one certain to stimulate enormous political pushback. After all, President Biden is doing this mostly by executive orders rather than by statute. And statute, of course, it refers to laws passed by the Congress through the constitutional process. Executive orders are not really in the Constitution, and therefore they fall into a constitutional gray area. Supposedly, the president can only issue an executive order to enforce a law that's already been passed by the Congress. What the president cannot do is issue an executive order in place of or in lieu of congressional action. To do so is overreach of the executive power. And some are claiming that this is exactly what President Biden is doing, that he is abusing his powers as president. Rather ironically, I think, some of those complaining about executive overreach are state governors, such as the governors of Florida and Texas, who are issuing their own executive orders to actually forbid public institutions, such as universities and K through 12 schools, from requiring vaccines, in some cases even forbidding them from issuing mask mandates. Some of these governors are making these moves because, well, they think it will help position themselves to win the Republican nomination for president in 2024. President Biden himself is actually acting under political pressure, as well as, I think, a genuine feeling of responsibility and need to respond to the public health emergency. But President Biden knows that his chances at being reelected are going to be extremely dim if he cannot get COVID under control. It is actually often hard to separate executive actions being taken to preserve the public health from actions being taken that are really all about political positioning for the next election. But what do we actually know about the government's power during a public health crisis? As for the government's basic authority, Professor Erwin Chemerinsky from the Hastings School of Law at Berkeley kind of made some of this clear in a recent editorial that was republished last Sunday in the Fresno Bee. As he notes, in 1905, during a smallpox outbreak in the United States, the US Supreme Court ruled in the case of Jacobson versus Massachusetts that given the severity of the public health emergency, the government had the authority to require inoculations. Based on this ruling, the Supreme Court in 1922 ruled that public schools could require all students to be vaccinated before attending. In other words, the government has the clear legal right to require vaccinations at public institutions. In fact, all 50 states now have vaccine requirements for their schools, and some states do not even allow for religious exemptions. The courts have consistently upheld all of these state vaccine mandates. So let's look then a little bit closer at universities, at public universities themselves, since that's where we all actually are. According to the Chronicle of Higher Education, about 1,025 colleges and universities, at least as of a few days ago, at least 1,025 colleges and universities in the United States now mandate vaccines for students, faculty, and staff. And of course, they've been doing this for decades, long before COVID. As a requirement for my employment here, I think I had to indicate some kind of level of the number of vaccines I'd taken, and I believe that most students have as well. So requiring a COVID vaccination was in no way new. Are these university vaccine mandates constitutional? Yes, that has actually been very recently made very, very clear. Earlier this year, in the state of Indiana, university students attending Indiana University sued that university over its vaccine mandate, claiming that it violated their due process rights under the Constitution's 14th Amendment. The courts, both the federal district courts and the appellate courts, the courts rejected this argument, holding that the public interest outweighed any private harm to these students. That is, and consistent with the earlier cases I'd mentioned, the severity of the public emergency, the importance of preserving the public health outweighs any harm done to the liberties of the private individual. In sum, universities appear to be on safe legal ground with their vaccine mandates. The University of Virginia, in fact, has taken a most unusual step, and it too is a public university. It has actually started to expel students who have been refusing to get vaccinated. Last I checked, earlier in the week, I think they've already disenrolled well over 200 students who are refusing to get vaccinated. The lingering concern then, especially for many of us who work and teach at public universities, and hopefully this is a concern for students as well, regards the religious exemptions in the university mandates. University vaccine mandates also allow a medical exemption, and it's a little hard to argue against this, but they also tend to permit religious exemptions. In 1944, the US Supreme Court in Prince versus Massachusetts held that the Constitution's First Amendment, and the First Amendment contains the Religious Liberty Clause, they held that the First Amendment does not automatically grant a religious exemption from school public health mandates. As the court wrote, quote, "The right to practice religion freely does not include liberty to expose the community or the child to communicable disease, or the latter to ill health or death," unquote. States may choose to have religious or personal belief exemptions to vaccine mandates, but it does not appear itself to be a constitutional right. That is, the religious exemption itself is not a clear constitutional right. California law, here in California, state law does allow for a religious exemption, though the scope of the exemption, meaning how easy it is to qualify, appears to be unclear. As preparing for this, I went back and read the applicable state law, and frankly, like a lot of law, it seemed a little really unclear, a little kind of hard to understand. Unfortunately, at least it's unfortunate in my opinion, the California State University system has chosen what seems to me to be the broadest religious exemption possible. All a student, or presumably a faculty or staff member, has to do is claim in writing that getting vaccinated is against his or her religious or spiritual beliefs in order to qualify for the exemption. It does not even appear to require ascribing to an established religion. So it's not a matter of to qualify that you have to get your priest, pastor, rabbi, imam, or anybody to certify in writing for you that you qualify for religious exemption. It seems that all you have to do is write for yourself, to attest for yourself that a vaccine would interfere or limit your spiritual beliefs. It seems that nearly any spiritual belief may do, perhaps even beliefs sort of invented that morning. We have been told that at Fresno State, 7.9% of our students on campus have claimed the religious exemption. Well, yes, they must be masked. Every student, every faculty member, every staff person on the campus has to be masked. And so anyone who claims the religious exemption and the medical exemption must get weekly tests. But this still potentially places the rest of the campus community at risk for COVID. They say it's a personal choice. Those who seek these exemptions, they say it's a personal choice. A personal choice. That argument only makes sense if their choice to be unvaccinated only puts them at risk and nobody else. But we know that this is clearly not true. First off, the unvaccinated are putting each other at risk, as well as anybody they come into contact with after leaving the campus, including their own friends and families. Second, while the vaccines are proving to be very powerful, breakthrough cases can still occur where people who are vaccinated can still contract COVID. This means that permitting unvaccinated students, faculty, and staff on the campus really puts everyone here at some degree of risk. CSU lawyers appear to be afraid of lawsuits if they enforce a tougher vaccine mandate. Why they are not afraid of being sued by people whom the university system knowingly put at risk by allowing the unvaccinated to come to campuses. I wonder why. In my mind, and it's purely in my opinion, the loose vaccination requirement is dangerous. There is no clear constitutional justification for it that I can see. Vaccines and a citizenry that understands and respects science are going to end the COVID crisis. And as a university, we are based on science. What we do, what we teach is based in science. And only by respecting science are we going to end the COVID crisis. We just have to make sure that we all have the will to really get the job done, to convince everybody else, including the unwilling, that they need to get vaccinated, and to help convince them how safe the vaccines themselves really are and how important it is, if not to themselves, then to their friends and families. That seems to be the challenge before us. No. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tom. That was powerful. I bet we'll get some responses. That'll be good. Let's see. So I think we said that Anne was going to speak next. Is that right? So Anne, the time is yours. Welcome.
All right. So since I don't even technically have a bachelor's degree yet, I am going to just stick with what I've experienced and what the pandemic has been like for me. I was very lucky as a retail worker to be employed by a retailer that was considered essential. So I worked throughout the pandemic. Even as soon as right before I left for Washington, D.C., I've been in the thick of it. And I was very lucky also to work for an employer that provided masks and gloves. But very early on, I made the conscious decision, I can't be afraid of something I can't control. So now, especially after I've had a vaccine, I'm not so worried about the current circumstances. I'm more worried about what we're going into in the future. What are the consequences of, as Dr. Holyoke said, this at least 2 years that we're going to spend in this period. I'm especially worried about student learning and equality of opportunity. We've seen absolutely atrocious things happening in rural areas who predominantly serve people of color and people under the federal poverty line. And I myself live in a Title I high school district. My brother goes to school there, and his school ended right in the middle of March. They didn't get any online schooling right until school started the next year. Everyone in that school lost all of that learning that was going to happen in the last half of that year because of the choices that that school district made. And all of their rural learning has been very, very puckered with plenty of inadequate access to internet, especially with these rural broadband issues that are now being brought up in Congress. I'm also worried about the economy. When we fully recover out of this pandemic, whenever that happens, are the entertainment sections going to fully return? What do job prospects look like for students who are going into entertainment, into hospitality, and into services? Are they going to have adequate employment? And what happens with them then? I'm also worried about the shifting population away from urban centers. We saw that California lost, for the first time in history, has lost a congressional representative due to slower relative population, but also presumably some amount of population leaving to other states. I'm worried about what that means for what California contributes to the union as a whole in the future. And we can see that cities are starting to maybe dwindle. What do cities look like after we come back? So this is a lot of the things that I'm starting to think about. And I think that this is really going to be a challenge for my generation, especially dealing with the loss of learning that so many younger children have faced. Thank you.
And thank you very much. Good job. Elise, it's your turn.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me all right? Well, thank you for taking the time to be here today, and thank you to Dr. Holyoke and Anne for your insightful remarks, and I appreciate your honesty regarding this pressing issue. I want to preface, like Anne, that in no way, shape, or form am I an expert on constitutional issues. I haven't been to law school yet, but check back with me afterwards. However, as a pre-law student at a public university and a person who is deeply passionate about protecting civil liberties and civil rights, I can't help but have my own position on this topic and feel obligated to share that position. As a philosophy student as well, I think about morality and ethics on a daily basis, especially surrounding political issues such as the pandemic. So when we approach these constitutional issues, it's important to consider the bigger picture here. In the case of vaccine and mask mandates, is our government exercising its power for the general welfare of the people, of the American people? Is the university trying to protect us by exercising these powers, by making us go to school within our bedrooms on Zoom? Are they trying to protect us in this way? And to me, I agree with Dr. Holyoke that the answer is a glaring yes. Now, I am fully vaccinated, and not only did I get vaccinated for myself, I got vaccinated for my mom, who suffers from chronic asthma and who is also a teacher. I got it because if she gets sick, I don't know whether she will survive the virus. I also got vaccinated for my uncle who has stage 4 pancreatic cancer. And I got it for the thousands of Americans and the millions in the world who have died, and the thousands of grieving families that are still with us today. When we get vaccinated, when we wear our masks, we're taking a position, one that says, I care about my fellow Americans, I care about humanity, and I want our species to continue to flourish and enjoy a life free from fatal disease. Now, of course, this position comes with sacrifice, and I understand people's concerns, those who don't trust the government, those who want to go back to school and just go back to a normal life. But the government has a responsibility, a duty to protect us from harm. Now, you see that every day. For example, when you get into your car to drive to work or school, you put your seatbelt on, or at least I hope you put your seatbelt on. We didn't always have seatbelt requirements. The government required them in 1986. When you drive, you obey the traffic signals so you don't crash into somebody. You don't drink while intoxicated so you don't kill yourself or others. You have the right to free speech, expression, and religion, but you can't yell fire in a crowded room. You can't incite harmful or violent lawless conduct, and you can't harm others through your religious practice. All of these public health laws in some way restrict our liberties. They do restrict our freedoms to go where we want, when we want, but they are constitutional. Legal precedent reveals that when it comes to weighing an individual's liberty against the compelling interest of the government to protect that individual from harm, to protect society from harm, that interest will always and should prevail. Now, this is demonstrated by the case that Dr. Holyoke cited earlier, Jacobson versus Massachusetts, decided in 1905. And I'd like to share a piece of that majority opinion that I think exemplifies my point. The liberty secured by the Constitution of the United States does not import an absolute right in each person to be at all times and in all circumstances wholly free from restraint, nor is it an element in such liberty that one person or a minority of persons residing in any community and enjoying the benefits of a local government shall have power to dominate the majority when supported in their action by the authority of the state. My point is that we do not live on this planet alone. We are a collective, we are a community, and I believe that we can get back to normal and have the freedom to go back to school, to be safe and to talk to our friends and interact without that fear of getting sick. But I also believe that we have a duty to protect each other from harm by getting vaccinated, wearing our masks, and trying our best to get through this together. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Well said. Professor Holyoke, I hope you're as impressed as I am with our students. And I mean, this is kind of cool to be able to have this conversation with our students. Tom, do you want to respond to what you heard from the students first? And then I'm going to just give a shout towards our audience as the Q&A is open. So feel free to use that Q&A function and I'll try to moderate those questions. But Professor Holyoke, maybe you'd like to respond to what you heard.
Yeah, just a quick comment on one thing from each. Also, both students, proudly admitted that they were vaccinated, and I did not, but I am vaccinated, so I am very proud of it, and I hope everybody out there is as well. One of the points that Anne brought up as a concern was quality of student learning at the universities, and I presume in K through 12 education too. That's been on the minds of a lot of us. In fact, it's when I get together with my colleagues, my fellow faculty members, that's one of the things we talk about. Are we right to have, we're doing the majority of our classes face-to-face here at Fresno State, and I think at the other CSUs as well for the most part. And we wonder, is this really the right way to be doing it? There was a lot of concern that learning purely by Zoom was not necessarily the best way to teach. Now, some of my colleagues are actually really good at it. A lot of the rest of us are probably really mediocre at it, and that this was perhaps not the best way for learning. And we're thrilled to be back in the classroom. Many of my students seem to be thrilled to be back in the classroom, but there is the health risk involved. So there's a lot of concern there. One of the points that Elise made, it just really kind of struck me, and I really hadn't thought about it before, but she was making reference to the fact that you can't shout fire in a crowded theater. That's sort of the basic test of free speech. You can't, your speech is free up to the point where the words you say cause direct and immediate harm to other people. Well, that's the exact same kind of thinking we should be taking with COVID, and and maybe a justification for not having generous exemptions. I can't shout fire in a crowded theater, but apparently if I have an exemption, I can get COVID, walk into a classroom and breathe over everybody. Now that's just not right. So those are my responses.
Yeah, thank you. I've been just thinking too, we need licenses to drive cars, and we need, licenses to own guns. I mean, there's all kinds of restrictions on our liberty, right? That I mean, it seems to fit in the same context with all of those restrictions. Let me get a couple of things in from the Q&A here. So one, Alex Walker is asking about the relationship between liberty and civic duty. And maybe if that is a way to kind of frame this conversation that, and I think Alex, if I'm understanding your question, that the recalcitrant folks want to claim that they have a liberty right to not participate in masking or vaccinations. But under the Constitution and in the United States, isn't there also a duty of some sort to be concerned about the common good and the general welfare?
Well, it certainly is stated as such in the preamble. But in any case, I think the response to Alex, another good political science major, is that that the public interest, in this case, public health, is the overriding concern. The civic duty of all of us who are citizens of the United States is to help get our country to that point. So you're going back to where I ended my remarks. I think our civic duty here, which in the long run will protect liberty, our civic duty is to find ways to persuade and maybe even sometimes prod and even perhaps force, I suppose, in some sense, our more reluctant fellow citizens to get the vaccination. That'd be my response.
Elise or Anne, what do you think about that question of duty, like an obligation almost? And I think, Elise, you expressed this very nicely about the reasons you got vaccinated, right? As a sense of responsibility or duty, that word. What do either of you think about this question?
Yeah, I think Elise really touched on it very well in her statements earlier. But I do think there's this famous quote that your right to swing ends where my nose begins. And I think that holds up very well here. When you haven't reached herd immunity yet, you're essentially swinging and hitting everyone's noses. And I think that's something that we need to consider.
I would respectfully disagree, just because, this is a matter of the survival of our species at the end of the day. If we don't get this under control, Americans are going to continue to die. People around the world are going to continue to die. And at the end of the day, I think regardless of political ideology, people believe that the right to life, the right to health, is something that should be prioritized. And when it comes to the Supreme Court and the Constitution, the government has to just come out and say, we have a compelling interest. We have the strict scrutiny test. We have intermediate scrutiny to test these laws that violate individual liberties. And when it comes down to it, the Supreme Court and the Constitution says that this is permissible. And not only that, not only is it constitutional, it's just the right thing to do at the end of the day, to not think beyond yourself, be selfless in the decision to make, to wear your mask and to get vaccinated, not for yourself, but just for the people who have died like you do, our soldiers and our veterans that have died or have damage as a result of war. This is an invisible enemy, and it's definitely not the same, but to make the analogy, as Americans, we do have to make our sacrifice for our community and for our country.
Tom, thank you, Elise. I'm trying to check some of the stuff in the Q&A here. And you had mentioned this in your remarks, so I think this is a connection and a question about carrots versus sticks. You used that language, Professor Holyoke, in your remarks. That someone is asking, what about the government just bribing people to get vaccinated? You give them a $50 gift card or something. And then I want you, if you could go back and say something more about those students that got expelled from the University of Virginia. That's a stick. I mean, that's a pretty heavy stick in a sense. Universities might be able to do that, but what about the larger population? What kind of sticks are there? I mean, I mean, I guess the real question is, how do we get more people to get vaccinated, carrots or sticks, and what's legal under the Constitution?
Well, going back to your first question on the government paying people to get vaccinated, I think that got tried. I can remember hearing, I think it was maybe over the summer, some states were, promising a little bit of money, or maybe it was, I don't know, something about a lottery. I kind of remember vaguely some of that they were trying to use financial incentives, but I don't think they got anywhere with it. So I think that maybe was tried and failed. As for the more punitive steps of kicking students out of a university, as apparently the University of Virginia is doing, I kind of wonder if the CSU is going to have to ultimately get to a position like that. I mean, theoretically here at Fresno State, we have till September 30th to, I think, get all of our students and faculty and staff, it's just not the students, vaccinated, or you have to have a legitimate exemption, although I think there's still some time after that to get some of these issues all kind of worked out. But at some point, you either must get vaccinated at Fresno State, or you must have an approved exemption. And if those are not met, you cannot come to the campus. That's not quite the same thing as expelling students, but the university may end up in a position where it has to move in that direction and be a little harsher. Because otherwise, how can we truly have a safe campus? And how can we truly get to a point, hopefully in the spring semester of 2022, where we can actually have normal classes and normal operations again? We were supposed to have them this semester, but it's because of people's reluctance to get vaccinated. And for that reason alone, really, that's why we're doing this weird system where everyone's masked, a lot of classes are still on Zoom and everything's chaotic.
Yeah, I think I wonder what's going to happen after September 30th. This will be interesting to watch. Elise or Anne, what do you think about that from the students' perspective? I mean, again, I'm not sure what the enforcement mechanism is, but what should happen after September 30th if students are still reluctant and are not playing along? And what do you think about that enforcement mechanism? And frankly, like the University of Virginia, should the CSU be kicking students out if they don't play along? What do you think?
I would be hesitant to jump right to kicking them out. I think that you could probably consider like suspension or some kind of probation, but I would be hesitant to jump right to kicking them out.
I wouldn't necessarily be opposed to it. I remember since kindergarten, I've had to submit immunization cards. I don't know if anybody else remembers. They're yellow and they're tiny, and you have to submit them to the school administration at age 5 and get your flu shot every year, or else you can't go to school. So it's not really, I think, that far-fetched. And unfortunately, people need incentive. They need a reason to do something other than the fact that people are dying.
Tom, is there a difference between higher ed and K-12 in this regard? Is that because Elise has pointed out, to go to get a high school diploma, you had to be vaccinated, and maybe not true in college. I don't know. What's the difference, or is there?
I'm a little vague on the difference myself in terms of the legality of it. I'm not sure in the state of California to the extent that we have the same kind of vaccine requirements. Now, I would point out that one huge difference in K through 12 is that a lot of those age groups are unvaccinated because it's not been approved for them yet. They can't be vaccinated yet. Whereas there is absolutely no reason that no university student cannot be vaccinated.
Something else from the chat. This is Emmanuel Agraz Torres, who is asking, it's a political question, not necessarily a constitutional legal question, but the question is, how do we pressure leaders, both world and local, to face their moral obligation to keep the public protected? How do we dwindle the greed in elections that are interfering with vital action? This may be more in your wheelhouse, Tom, than the constitutional. How's the politics of this playing out in the United States, and how, and frankly, let me ask maybe even a little stronger. Are you hopeful? Can we fix this given the political dynamics in the United States, the way things are unfolding?
In general, at this point in time, I don't have a great deal of faith in politics. I don't think that there is a clear political solution to the problems of COVID. In fact, the more the government has pressed, the more stubborn an awful lot of people have become. I mean, it's a long tradition of liberty in the United States to, if the government wants it, then it must be bad and I shouldn't do it. And that's led a lot of people to resist the whole notion of a required vaccine. And the more the government presses, the more resistant they're going to get. It's almost kind of like a law of physics applied to politics. The more the government presses, an equal and opposite reaction takes place. People have to be persuaded, but not persuaded by the government. They need to be persuaded by friends and family, or fear. I mean, I guess if there's any upside at all to the Delta variant, is I think sheer terror did start pushing vaccine rates up again for a little while. But there's no real political solution, especially when there's politicians out there who are building their political careers on resistance to the vaccine mandates, as we've seen with, say, Governor DeSantis in Florida or Governor Abbott in Texas.
Elise or Ann, you've been watching. You're growing up and viewing the American political scene. What do you think? Are you worried about the way that this American dysfunction is playing out in light of COVID? What are your thoughts or concerns about this? Elise, you want to comment?
Sure. I definitely think that there has been a vast difference in the way that our country has responded to the pandemic versus others. And that's unfortunate. And I think that it's in the American political culture to hold your civil liberties and rights so dearly. And I don't think that that's a bad thing at all. However, that comes at a price of forgetting that the entire point of public safety laws and all of these restrictions is to benefit people, even when they don't know that they're benefiting from it. So I'm a little disappointed in people that, but I understand where they're coming from. I understand the mistrust with the government, especially one that has often failed to protect our liberties. However, the bigger picture here is protecting life.
Ann, do you care to comment on this, the political situation? Ann, just to remind you, you made this interesting claim about inequities in the response to COVID having to do with education, which is another part of the political dysfunction, not only at the level of politicians, but divides within our own communities. What do you think about all of these things?
So I believe that the question mentioned world leaders, implying some kind of international relations facet to this question, right? I think that ultimately, I wouldn't start any trade wars over COVID vaccination, but I think that what you can do is say, hey, if you want to fly into the United States port of entry, you have to have proof of vaccination. I think that might work. But you have to be careful, especially now, I would say, with the current state of affairs in the world, about putting pressure on which issues and selecting the battles that you want to fight.
Can I go back to something earlier in the Q&A? And Professor Holyoke, maybe you could address this. This is Alex Walker had posted another question about the conservative, in quotes, in scare quotes, court. And that I'll just read it. It says, with a more conservative court, one that some argue may be more sympathetic to religious liberty arguments, is there reason to think that vaccine mandate precedent can change, affecting not just current efforts to vaccinate against COVID, but other required vaccinations? In other words, the court, the new structure, the new political structure of the court, maybe those previous vaccine mandates are now up for grabs because the court may be more deferential towards the religious liberty arguments. Professor Holyoke, what do you think about that?
Well, that's always certainly possible. I mean, we're in many areas, we're watching, judicial rulings start to shift because of the new balance on the court. And that could actually have ramifications for vaccine mandates. Now, I think at this point, the court has not made any rulings that directly affect vaccine mandates. And I can't remember if they chose not to take up the Indiana University case, or if they do, it probably wouldn't come to the next term, so that'd still be some time off. So I don't think in the really immediate future, the court's going to get overly involved in this, but in the long run, yeah, it could.
And this also, that question goes back to that religious liberty exemption, which can we push on that a little bit too? Because you had said, I think almost 8% of Fresno State students are claiming the religious exemption, but without really any validation, right? You could just say, I'm opposed to this. As you said, this morning I woke up and I had an epiphany. Suddenly my religion is opposed. We don't want to do, because there are legitimate religions that are opposed to this kind of stuff. But do you want to just reiterate your thoughts about that? I'd love to hear Elise and Anne, if you have opinions about this. And then I'll just throw it out there, the medical exemption too, because that was also in the Q&A. But Tom, what else do you want to add about the religious exemption?
Well, I mean, I think as far as the medical exemption at Fresno State goes, the numbers I've seen say that only about 1% of students have claimed an exemption under that. Okay, and to do that, I think you actually have to have some kind of a doctor's note. Fair enough. The religious exemption, now, I've not seen any information on just how students are claiming this. Maybe the 8% of students who are claiming it are actually, you're saying they're part of a recognized, organized religion that for whatever reason is against vaccine mandates. Although my understanding is that actually most organized religions are pro-vaccine. But so I don't know if there's any students who are kind of, making up their religion or spiritual beliefs for an exemption. So I don't know that. That's just the fear I have that could happen. So kind of, I mean, looking beyond that, there's this, I guess, a balance that we need to find between showing some respect for religious liberty, but also the public safety. And right now, I think, at least the way it's being done in the California State University system, I think there's at the moment a little too much emphasis on religious liberty and maybe not quite enough on the overall public health, since everyone at the 23 campuses is at risk.
Elise or Anne, would you want to add a thought about that at all? Elise?
I think.
Or Anne, go ahead, Anne, go ahead.
Sorry. I think that the religious exemption issue is definitely, that's a tough one to deal with. Because you don't want to, you have to really be careful about how you tailor these things. And I think that's what makes it such a struggle, and maybe why the CSU system could have chosen that wider approach that Dr. Holyoke alluded to in his original statements. Because you don't want to eliminate people who genuinely hold like spiritual beliefs that are against vaccination. I believe Church of Christ Scientists, I think they're pretty anti-medication in general. But you also don't want to just make it a loophole that anyone who doesn't want to get vaccinated can just drive right through. So it's going to be a tough one for the courts to decide, I think, in the future.
Elise?
In this case, I don't mean any disrespect to any religion or faith. However, I don't believe that the freedom of religion would outweigh public safety, especially when a component of your faith puts other people at harm. The government has time and time again said to, say, business owners, you can't deny people service because because your religion or the business owner says that they're against serving homosexual couples, because at the end of the day, that violates civil rights. In this case, we have people that are going to be harmed by not the action, but the inaction. And it is important to express your religious liberty, express your religious beliefs. But as soon as they hurt you, as soon as they hurt other people in the community, that's when the government needs to come in and say, well, this needs to be restricted. In the same way that all First Amendment rights have always been restricted: speech, association, protest, redressing grievances. These are all restricted and regulated rights, and religion is no different.
I'm looking at the clock. We got about 5 minutes left. So maybe I could invite kind of a summary and conclusion from you all. One question I have, and you don't have to respond to this, is the pandemic showing us the strength of the Constitution, or is it showing us part like the dysfunction of the Constitution? And how hopeful are we that our constitutional system is up to this challenge? And again, you're welcome to comment on whatever you want, but maybe if we could ask our students to comment first, and then Tom, you could kind of wrap it up for us. So, Anne, why don't we invite you to speak first? Parting thoughts. Go ahead.
I think that times like this show how the Constitution continues to be applied even after, over 200 years of existence. I think that it's marvelous how flexible a document it was, considering how different things were in 1787. And I think that even though challenges continue to come up, that's not new. I think that we've had other challenges, some would say even more serious, like Plessy v. Ferguson and segregation, I think was a more serious challenge to the Constitution than the vaccine mandate. But I think it does highlight how flexible the Constitution is and how easily applied it is to so many different situations.
Elise?
Well, I'm definitely a loose constructionist. I believe that the Constitution is a living document. And I don't think the founding fathers could have predicted how many people we have in our nation today, how fast viruses can and vary, and at the rate that they can harm people and kill so many people. So it needs to be applied in a way that protects people's interests. And I think that it does so. So we'll always have these constitutional crises because people disagree about what the words mean and how they should be applied to today's issues. But in another sense, I think we should just focus on today and what we should do, what's best for our country.
So in my opinion, I think the Constitution itself is doing just fine because it gives us kind of a broad framework in which to discuss and deal with these things. The original 6 articles of the Constitution, that's all about government power and what the government can do. Then you have the Bill of Rights, and that's the opposite. It's all about what government cannot do, limits on government authority. And somewhere between there, it falls on us as a citizenry to try to figure out where the balance is. And of course, if we can't figure it out, then the Supreme Court will step in and figure it out for us, which I think it's kind of unfortunate that we would look to the Supreme Court to solve such things. But it should fall on us as an educated citizenry to determine that, okay, the public interest is clearly served by getting as absolutely as many people vaccinated as possible here. That if we don't do that, this is going to be with us for a long time. A lot of people are going to continue to die. The economy is going to be ravaged, and we're going to start falling apart as a nation. I mean, clearly, the public interest here outweighs the private concern, and the Constitution gives us room in which to say that. And we've talked about the free speech issues where you cannot say things that cause harm to other people. Your speech is limited at that point. Well, it isn't really any different when it comes to public health, I don't think. We have to do what's right for all the people.
Thank you, Professor Holyoke. This is, I mean, obviously there's a lot more to talk about. This is, that's the beauty of living in a country like this. We get to continue the conversation. Let me wrap up. A couple of folks have asked in the Q&A if they could take a screenshot of our event. Yes, the answer is yes, go ahead. You're welcome to do that if you need to turn it in for a course or something. We understand that. And then let me also just say thank you to all of the people in the Q&A. There was a lot of questions, and I did my best to kind of summarize those and keep the conversation going. So thank you to our participants. It's great that you guys are sharing your afternoon with us. And then thank you to our two student panelists, Anne and Elise. You guys did a great job. And I think you remind us of why we're doing this. Is like, you guys have learned stuff here at Fresno State, and you're smart and you're articulating these. I mean, bravo. Thank you for joining us, and good luck when you apply for law school. And then let me also thank Professor Holyoke. Wonderful presentation today. Thank you to the colleagues in the political science department for making this happen. And you guys have a great weekend. We're done. I appreciate all of your work. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye.